welcome to Accessibility and Cold War Intelligence. 50 years on. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us, either in person or online. I'm intrigued to investigate this new perspective on the Cold War as we mark National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Today's presenter, David A. Taylor, is the author of Cork Wars, Intrigue and Industry in World War II, and other books and articles. Today, he'll share his findings as he has searched through declassified documents and other records to uncover the stories of those with disabilities working in the intelligence field during the Cold War. Now, before I turn this over to David, I have to say that I'll always feel an incredibly strong attachment to him because in March of 2020, we did our last pre-pandemic in-person program with David about Cork Wars. And that was before a long shift to virtual, which was actually terrific because now we do hybrid programs. But my goodness, it's good to see you in person, David. So enough from me. Over to you, David Taylor, for this very cool talk.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Yeah, that was a great event, and it was right up to the wire before everything shut down. Thank you also to Shauna and to Ben and everyone at the museum who make these events possible. I'm pleased to be here, as Amanda mentioned, during a Disability Employment Awareness Month. It's rare that we see representations of people with disabilities in spy movies or books or the popular culture. And it's true that the physical risks of the work make the job a challenge for people with some conditions, but we have examples from history that we'll talk about, and undoubtedly there are more. It's just a matter that's often been seen as a niche and often not widely explored. One of the best known spies with disability may be Virginia Hall, the World War II master spy who was featured in the museum's permanent exhibit, I'm happy to see. In the 1930s, she was working for the State Department when she was injured in a hunting accident in Turkey. And as a result, part of her left leg had to be amputated. After that, she was turned down for another foreign service post. They had a rule against hiring someone with a disability. But during the war, Virginia Hall wanted to serve the Allied cause, and so she joined the French resistance. And she was deep behind enemy lines. Her cover was as a reporter. This was from her passport photo, based in Lyon. And after she helped a dozen resistance fighters escape, she was basically put on the Nazi most wanted list. And then finally, as the Gestapo was closing in on her, she escaped by hiking over the Pyrenees on the prosthetic leg, which she had named Cuthbert. She said sometimes you would be surprised what's in Cuthbert sometimes. She covered about 50 miles on foot in 2 days over the mountains and escaped. She returned to France in 1944, then, working with the OSS. She observed German troop placements and coordinated scouting of landing sites ahead of the D-Day operation. And she oversaw sabotage missions, coordinated supply drops, and planned ambushes. So she just did a tremendous job. And understandably, then after the war, she became one of the CIA's first female operation officers and was the only female civilian in World War II to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Small wonder she's one of the hidden heroes who will be celebrated this month, or next month, here. Even with her example, however, disability and intelligence services can be seen as a very niche topic and rarely gets a spotlight. There are a few studies from the other side of the Cold War that look at disabled activists in intelligence under communist rule who found ways also to advance their group, their visibility, and their comrades. In fact, the socialist approach to disability involved shared interest groups more than the individualist approach of the West. And so some blind and deaf activists in Eastern Europe, many of them veterans who had lost their sight or hearing during the war, used state associations and organizations to leverage support for their cause and for their interests. Here, however, I'll talk mainly about two stories of Cold War intelligence involving people with disabilities from the West. The first is Lyman Kirkpatrick Jr., who served with distinction in the OSS during World War II, before he joined the CIA when it started. He seemed bound for high things in the agency until he was struck by an adult case of infantile paralysis, or polio. And the second I'll talk about today is actually my father, William Taylor Sr., who, like Kirkpatrick, contracted polio as an adult in one of the last epidemics before successful vaccines were developed. I'm old enough to remember the sugar comb cube delivery system that made polio vaccines sweet. I'm not sure if others here remember that. A few. And like Kirkpatrick, my father faced his disability after an early promising career, in his case as an Army engineer. He, after a lot of physical therapy after his polio and rehab, he returned to that work and had a brush with Soviet intelligence over nuclear energy secrets, and that led to an attaché's expulsion from the U.S. That would come back to haunt my father years later when he was on the verge of taking a group to Moscow. But more on that in a bit. First, Lyman Kirkpatrick. As one former CIA historian told me, in the intelligence community, until very recently, if you were disabled, you might get a job in D.C. Behind a desk, but not overseas. The best-known case, he said, was Kirkpatrick, described as an up-and-comer, maybe even possible future director of the agency. As a young man, Kirkpatrick had the qualifications for intelligence work. He graduated from Princeton in 1938, having studied political science, became a reporter for the Bureau of National Affairs. He edited newsletters on labor relations, patents, and legal issues during the war, or actually even before the war started. He joined the U.S. News and World Report in 1940. Then in 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, he applied for war leave from U.S. News and joined what became the OSS. So I did some research in the National Archives, looking at records both for my father's service as well as for Kirkpatrick's, and found some declassified OSS personnel files for Kirkpatrick. And one form lists his 1942 title as Junior Administrative Assistant, SI London. His salary was $1,000 per year, and he's sent to London for an indefinite term. And then after that, there's a little record for almost 3 years. Then in 1945, in June, there's a terse memo that asserts the services of the following named officer are considered essential to OSS. Major Lyman Kirkpatrick, assigned to Groton Long Point, Connecticut. He was slated to receive the Legion of Merit for his service as officer in charge of Omar Bradley's G2 Division headquarters for 4 months in early 1945. After managing communications for a unit in the D-Day invasion, the notice said, under Major Kirkpatrick's able direction, the G2 Situation Room developed into an outstanding example of graphic illustration of the enemy's situation and was known as one of the finest in the European theater. He strove with telling effect to achieve a center of information which should be a masterpiece of accuracy and an up-to-date, up-to-the-moment place of reference for officers from the highest headquarters. Lyman accepted the award with no great show of pride, and sending his paperwork that they requested for it. He said, Larry, here's all the stuff on the OLM. Just have them let me know when to appear. Kirk. And with that, with the war's end and then the start of CIA, he signed on as a career intelligence officer and excelled in that capacity for 5 years. And he was on assignment in Asia when his life changed. He contracted polio there, as President Roosevelt had as an adult decades before. But for Kirkpatrick, it had a similar long-term impact. He was paralyzed from the waist down, and for the rest of his life, needed a wheelchair. His career as a field officer, obviously at that point, his ability to move and adapt quickly was over. But he returned to work at a desk job and rose to the CIA's Inspector General position. And that involved its own set of tricky and prickly situations. As Inspector General, he conducted internal investigations of agency actions, some of which became notorious, including the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. He also investigated things like the 1950s death of an Army biochemist who died while using LSD in a CIA experiment. Obviously, those were very secret. The biochemist plunged to his death from the Hotel Statler in New York. The CIA hid the truth about the experiment. It was totally shut down from the man's family, even, until 1975, when it came out in news reports. Kirkpatrick never testified publicly about that case, but he reportedly recommended that the agency employees who administered the drug be disciplined. That was a rare instance of that kind of a recommendation. They were not. Kirkpatrick also reportedly went on the record within the agency as opposing a plan to assassinate the Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, who was later killed in 1961 by insurgents. So he had his independence of thought, and he had great integrity. He prepared briefings on the CIA for the Eisenhower administration when it prepared for the transfer of power in December 1960. And then in 1961, he became executive director, the agency's number 3 slot. In that role in 1962, he delivered a White House briefing for President Kennedy on reorganizing the agency. So he continued to give high-level briefings. I think his independence of analysis, his ability to speak truth to power, gained its admirers at the highest levels. In a TV interview on DC's station WMAL, Kirkpatrick admitted that his ambition had been to be the first career man to head the agency. That's what every career officer in the agency has hoped for over the years. But that was not to be his situation. The interviewer also asked him about his experience after polio. And Kirkpatrick said, "It's a terrible shock to suddenly realize that after having led a vigorous life, that you're henceforth going to be confined to a wheelchair." And such words as handicapped or crippled or things like that were initially a shock to the system, understandably. After recovering many of his abilities, he said, "Once I got used to the fact that I wasn't really terribly different than I was before, getting around in a wheelchair, it's a question of personal determination. And there's nothing I can't do, from cut the grass or drive the car to travel around the world." In 1965, when he retired from the agency, his staff gave him a plaque that said in Latin, "Hell on Wheels." And that was later explained as a reference to his firm demeanor and the fact of his wheelchair ride. He stood out and didn't mind standing out on issues of integrity. In 1977, again, at the start of a new administration, Kirkpatrick was invited to give a White House briefing and had a short meeting with Zbigniew Brzezinski and President Carter. A week later, Kirkpatrick then was in the mix for an appointment as deputy director of Central Intelligence, according to one of the declassified memos I found, with Jimmy Carter checking the box approved. But that appointment didn't come through. Kirkpatrick died in 1995. And then in the spring of 2001, on the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs, his Inspector General's internal critique of the operation was declassified. A senior analyst at the National Security Archive, historian Peter Kornbluh, said, the CIA's own Inspector General put the blame squarely on the agency. itself for engaging in what was essentially an overt paramilitary operation, which it had neither the responsibility, as the IG pointed out, nor the capability of doing so. So my father, William Taylor, definitely would have echoed Kirkpatrick's sentiment on the issue of personal determination. Bill Taylor's career as an Army engineer took place at the edges of the intelligence sector, and I think like many who work in science and engineering and in the military, that is the case. So that's one thread that we will see, and perhaps there are other stories as well, of those not necessarily professional spies, but those who get pulled in that way. Like Kirkpatrick, he contracted polio as an adult. In fact, in the same epidemic, in his case in 1953, the last one before effective vaccines. He had been a young officer in the Army Engineers, recruited after West Point. He graduated in 1945, and then on secret orders, he was asked to join, or ordered to join, a small team in Los Alamos to get trained in nuclear technology before the civilian scientists who were assembled left the Manhattan Project. After that experience, he then enrolled in the graduate engineering program at Johns Hopkins, particularly in electrical engineering, got involved with nuclear energy. After he contracted polio, he spent a year in an iron lung. So he nearly died a number of times. That technology, the iron lung, was this big coffin-like machine that functioned it still does, as a respirator for people whose breathing muscles have failed. When he finally left it after that year, he was told he'd never walk again, and he was charged at 100% disability. And they actually tallied up the percentages by what he had lost. And he sometimes liked to point out that if you added the paperwork figures up, it added up to 110%, kind of showing the bureaucracy at work. With the physical therapy, including at Warm Springs Rehab Center that FDR made famous, Bill learned what he called tricks of the trade and working around the after effects. Our dad could MacGyver his way through the able-bodied world. As a West Point trained engineer, he would find a workaround if there was one possible. With a car mechanic on Route 1 in Alexandria in the 1950s, he jury-rigged some levers onto the gear shift of the steering column of our Ford station wagon, making an early version of power steering. This was about 3 years before it became a commercial thing from the automakers. So he would work whatever options he could to make this work. Here, he's at a work function with my mother. I believe that's in the early 70s. He walked with a cane. He sometimes used a wheelchair at home. And he kept his paralyzed left arm at his side or with a leather brace. But we rarely talked about polio or its effects at home. And I later learned that was typical for polio survivors, and particularly kind of following the FDR model of just accommodate and assimilate as much as possible. I remember when I was in first grade, my teacher was talking about disabilities and asked the class, do you know anybody with a disability? Nobody said anything. I didn't say anything. I didn't think of anybody for a while. And then I realized, well, my dad walks with a cane. He can't use his arm. So I raised my hand. And the teacher, who knew my father well, she was startled too. She hadn't thought of him. So people who didn't know him would see a man with a cane. But people who knew him got a different impression. He was a guy with a strong handshake, had ideas, who had questions and asked questions, wanted to know what you were involved in and what you were interested in. In the 1950s, as I mentioned, he was worked as a civilian with the Atomic Energy Commission, and that brought his first brush with Cold War intelligence. In 1956, after he published an academic paper on nuclear power, he got a phone call at home from a man with a Russian accent. The man said his name was Yuri Krylov. He had read my father's paper and wanted to talk about it. To buy time, Bill said he had to check his calendar at his office. He reported the contact to the security office at Fort Belvoir following protocol, and they huddled with the FBI and confirmed that Captain Yuri Krylov was a new attaché at the Soviet embassy. So the FBI said, well, go ahead and meet with him. He arranged for Krylov then to come visit us actually at our home. So knowing he couldn't manage a confrontation if it came to that, Bill asked his brother Jay, who lived a block away, to be on call for help. They had already rigged up a kind of a baby intercom so that between the two homes, the two couples could visit each other and not hire a sitter. This time they set it up as a security link. Jay would be on call during the Soviets' visit. Bill would have Krylov in our living room seated near the intercom. Jay would come running if Krylov tried anything. This plan has obvious weaknesses. It would take Jay several minutes to come if there was any issue, but that nothing. Krylov arrived in the Chevy sedan wearing a dark suit. He and my father talked beside the fireplace near the intercom. Krylov asked questions about nuclear power, and Bill gave unclassified answers. And my dad saw that the Russian was, like himself, a young Army engineer who had had some graduate level training. So they had things in common. He kind of warmed up to the guy a little bit personally. At the end, Krylov offered Bill $15 for his time. Bill declined and said maybe they could meet again. Later, when the FBI showed photos of Soviet attachés, there was Krylov, the man he'd met. Another meeting was arranged. If Krylov offered cash again, my father was to accept it. That seemed odd. Just before the second meeting, though, the FBI changed the plan and told Bill to cancel. So he had to make up a lame excuse, a travel conflict. Krylov then went on and his own nuclear road trip across North America, buying parts where he could and scoping out nuclear facilities, including in the Pacific Northwest. Were military intelligence tracked his movements. I found those records in the archives as well. And an informant report states that Krylov is interested in anything connected with atomic energy. In early 1957, the U.S. expelled him, saying he had tried to buy nuclear secrets, but was thwarted by a tip from a civilian. Fast forward 20 years, and Bill Taylor is leading a scientific delegation to Moscow, piloting a tech exchange between the superpowers in the Cold War. This exchange would focus on a relatively safe topic, building foundations, specifically building on permafrost, where the Soviets had experience. But if that trip was successful, it might lead to other exchanges and maybe an opening between the two sides, possibly helping to ease the Cold War. But the question was my father in condition to go on such a trip? Normally, someone in his situation would not be a candidate, of course, for overseas work. Certainly no intelligence agency would have him. And even 5 decades later, the former CIA historian I spoke with expected that the situation would be much the same now, though policies might reflect updated language from the Americans with Disabilities Act. But there were other risks as well. Just mobility-wise, I mean, my father often did like to push the limits. He wouldn't probably use a wheelchair during this trip. At home, from year to year, he would, once or twice a year, he would fall over and he couldn't block his fall, so he would have to rely on someone to help him up. But apart from that, he also wondered, what if Yuri Krylov was now a senior intelligence officer in Moscow? If he held a grudge, would he be waiting in the Moscow airport? Well, in addition, in the intervening 2 decades, my father had accrued more classified experiences, including geodetic research, satellite telemetry, and 5 years with NASA, where he worked from 1962 to 1967, first with a CIA liaison to study the Soviet space program. The race to the moon was a real race, as historian Charles Fishman has written, motivated by the Cold War and sustained by politics. NASA worked with the CIA to gauge the competition. What was the Soviet plan for lunar exploration? Would they reach the moon before the US? After Yuri Gagarin became the first person in space in 1961, Americans knew we shouldn't underestimate the Soviet program. The main mystery was whether they were working toward a manned lunar landing or an unmanned probe. So NASA and the CIA's Deputy Director for Science and Technology assembled a small team of engineers from both agencies to study the data. So my father was asked to head that team alongside other duties, and for several months he spent half his time commuting to Langley. He later described that period as working in days in sort of compartmentalized and windowless offices, which was strange for the NASA members of the team. They pored over satellite photos, telemetry data, and cables about Vostok, the Soviet spacecraft. And they were working backwards from that data, from images and descriptions, to reverse engineer what the insides of Soviet rockets and probes looked like. And it's a very, particularly at that point, a very awkward way to work. They didn't always trust the data. They got weird answers. At one point, their analysis suggested that Russians were designing a spherical craft. And NASA engineers thought, this seems very crude. But then a year later, the Soviets unveiled the sphere design at a Paris International Air Show. In 1965, the team predicted that the Soviets would probably launch a manned space station by 1968, but that a manned lunar landing was not a Soviet priority. The CIA kept assessing the race for years as Apollo got closer to a lunar mission. My dad, meanwhile, he asked to return full-time to NASA and the Apollo program. Spy work, he said, is interesting and sometimes exciting, but being a professional spy is not my cup of tea, he said. He then worked with the manned space program and its head, George Muller. Muller was hailed as one of NASA's most brilliant and fearless managers. And there he is. He played a key role in Apollo missions, as well as in planning Skylab and the space shuttle. After his NASA experience, Bill Taylor returned to the Army Corps of Engineers and researched supporting troop mobility and mine detection in Vietnam. His experience as a research manager there and through his career got him on a list to lead a group of U.S. scientists and engineers to the Soviet Union in 1975, so hence the 50 years ago. Before that trip, Bill would likely have received an intelligence briefing from Pentagon security with the usual warnings: don't change money on the black market, watch for unusually friendly pretty girls, don't expect secret phones to save you. But mainly the Pentagon's security office urged, just very simply, to keep close to his group and not to get separated. So in 1975, November, 6 months after the fall of Saigon, Bill flew with his team through Istanbul to Moscow. On the last leg, he got a blitz course in Russian and Cyrillic from a Russian emigre who had come to the West as a boy. And I found my father's handwritten notes of that lesson in his date book. They landed in Moscow in a heavy snowstorm. Bill was greeted by his counterpart, an engineer named Boris Fedorov, a bespectacled man with a great big beard, and he whisked Bill off to his official lead car as leader of the delegation, and then the doors closed, and it was just Fedorov, Bill, the driver, and the Soviet interpreter. So he hadn't been in Moscow an hour, and he had already become separated from his team against the Pentagon guidance. But after several rounds of vodka, he was returned to his group for a welcome dinner. The trip continued with some suspense and uncertainties. Boris Fedorov was then director of the Soviet Research Institute of Foundation and Underground Structures. He was 7 years older than my father. In the 1950s, he had worked on tall buildings in Moscow, factories and state power plants. And he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. So he was a natural at the manager level to serve as host for this group. Soon after they arrived at the hotel on Red Square, and this photo is from then, A desk clerk demanded all the group's passports and took them away, brushing off all questions. And so the American delegation was a bit rattled and calmed down only with another round of drinks at the hotel bar. But eventually, they got them back. The trip continued. They flew to Central Asian republics and construction sites in Tashkent, in present-day Uzbekistan, where construction of the city's subway was underway, as DC's subway was under construction at that time. Back in Moscow, they boarded an overnight train on the Red Star, then to Leningrad, where they stayed in the Astoria Hotel, and they got a tourist visit to the Hermitage Art Museum, a favorite of Fedorov's. So Bill and his host had a series of meetings to hammer out plans for future technical exchanges, aiming for a formal agreement at the end for those. The negotiations hit a sticking point and kept him from the group events, again, separating him from his team. At the last minute, the English language version still did not include a provision for exchanges that they had agreed to. And so, we'll ask that the provision be typed into both documents. But his hosts hedged and said, well, the deputy minister is waiting for us at the banquet hall. Go ahead and just sign this version. We'll work it out afterwards. But he held firm, and they finally agreed. They typed it into the agreement, and then they joined the deputy minister for the farewell banquet. So my father came home with a few Russian phrases and some respect for the Soviet engineers, although construction methods there struck him as subpar. A souvenir gift for me was a big Soviet star brass buckle. Despite the tense moments, the trip was a success and did lead to other scientific exchanges. My father retired from government a couple of years later and became a consultant on renewable energy after that. Disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things we need to lead our lives, said the disability rights pioneer Judy Heumann. Things like job opportunities. Lyman Kirkpatrick embodied that positive outlook. I was disappointed that the CIA recently took down a webpage summarizing his service. The link from this Facebook post on the left a couple of years ago, taking you to the CIA site 404, as you see on the right. So I asked the CIA's web team about it if it had been moved, and they said they had simply refreshed the website, but there was no new page dedicated to him elsewhere in that way. Yet the CIA site does address the concept of accessibility, saying at CIA we want to emphasize the essential roles of officers with disabilities and the importance of inclusive policies and practices. We want to ensure that people seeking to contribute to our mission are able to do so, and that they have access to the services in order to do so. I think Virginia Hall and Lyman Kirkpatrick and my father would all strongly endorse that idea, that when everyone has what they need to thrive, the mission can get done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So, Mr. Kirkpatrick has some connection to, the planned assassination of Lumumba, the death of Olson in the MK Ultra program, possibly the Bay of Pigs as an IG Inspector General. Right. Has he been absorbed into any conspiracy theories? I'm just wondering, because that's a lot of things to have tangential relationships with.
Not that I've found in my research on him. I think partly because sometimes he's often speaking against the collective efforts, or anyway. But that's an interesting question. If others have seen something where he is, I'd be curious to hear.
It just seems like if you're attached to any of these things, eventually you become. He's speaking out against it because he's actually behind it. So.
Right. Yeah. False.
Yeah. All right. And then regarding person is very fascinated about the family intercom switched to spyware.
Yes.
Do you remember anything about that personally?
I don't. By the time I came along, that was my aunt and uncle didn't live so close by. But it was, I was very intrigued by that technology too, in the 50s, to be able to. They were both kind of, both Jay and my dad were sort of home techie inspired, so they probably worked something out.
I think nanny cams have probably been used like that more recently. Okay, this guest is concerned that your father was only offered $15.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty small amount. And I think it was for his time. And I think it was the idea probably was that it would be so small that it wouldn't signal some like bribe. It would seem like just like a very honorarium thing, but it was clearly intended to sort of start the way towards more obligation.
Do you have any sense of the other sums that were offered to others?
I don't. I haven't seen other in that comparable phase, even though I did come across other appointments that Krylov made. For example, in Maryland, he met up with someone at a parts store and simply bought the parts directly. Wasn't getting technical information, but was buying parts.
All right, and I have one more question from online. If nobody here has one, so. Did your father ever get any other outreach after he retired or when he came back from the Soviet Union?
Not to my knowledge, and I've seen his files. He worked with a wide range of international experts on renewable energy, particularly Western and Northern Europe, but not to my knowledge from the former Soviet Union.
And just thank you so much for including Virginia Hall in this, very near and dear. I see another question here. And I'm wondering, it seems like there would have been other World War II veterans. So I don't know if you
seemed to be, there were, not much came up. There was, I'll think, in different capacity. I mean, Alan Turing seemed to be on the spectrum, the great sort of decryptor and the who did such a brilliant decryption of the Enigma for the British. So there's some other sort of on the neurodiverse spectrum. There would be him, but really, if there are others that's why I would really welcome others coming up.
I can make a comment about that, and in the process, I'll give a shout out to my old friend and neighbor, Ace Rossner, who was in World War II, was injured in Anzio in 1944, and as a result of that injury, his arm was amputated. So he had a lot of trouble in the field with the medical care. In fact, his brother was nearby and gave him a transfusion that saved his life. Came back to Walter Reed, patched him up, and then he went back into active duty. I understand that he was the only active duty amputee in the military. So after the war is over, 1951, he joins the CIA under the cover of a Army officer and continued to work overseas and at Langley for the rest of his career. John Kelly, that was from the Washington Post, who writes a lot of human interest stories, did an article about him some years ago. In fact, he had quite a hobby on antique cars, and because he was traveling all over the world, he had probably at one time 30 or 40 cars in our garage in the apartment building, many of which he had bought overseas. And I understand the CIA would sometimes have a car show there. He would bring some of his cars for the car show. And they were in some parades as well in town here. So anyway, you can probably look up John Kelly's old article about it.
And say his name again?
He used the name Ace. His name was Adolf Rossner, Adolf C. Rossner, and anyway. So
thanks.
Quite an interesting career. Exactly to the point of your question about World War II vets. So anyway,
yeah.
Wow. See, that's how research happens.
Exactly.
That's how you get a lead. All right. So this guest wondered if anyone in your family was inspired to follow in your father's footsteps.
In terms of, well,
that's all they wrote.
All right. Well, we have the pleasure of my brothers in the audience here, and William Taylor Jr., who followed in footsteps in terms of going to West Point and then into international work. And so, yes, in that sense, and I think broadly, my father inspired a number of people, but that's one very direct.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Do you think it's possible that there's any sort of link between the prevalence of polio in the era which you're speaking about and the inroads people suffering from those after effects were able to accomplish?
That's an interesting question. It's very possible that that some were often. I think the experience of President Roosevelt, seen as someone who everybody knew that he had polio, and that he was able to, get, find a way to lead a full life, probably made it possible for others, both internally and also physically, to make that as a model. They could picture it, and they could be accepted more, perhaps publicly also as a result of that. It's interesting. Judy Heumann, the disability rights advocate I mentioned, she had childhood polio, and she was a leader in terms of making change happen. I think because of the combination of the nature, it's a less, in some ways, a less othered form of disability, and I think in that sense, perhaps there's was entry point for that generation. There also the fact of there was an increasing wave of polio sufferers. So the last waves were among the most severe before the vaccines were developed. So there were increasing numbers of people affected. And then decades after they survived, they realized the post-polio effects and syndromes were also evident.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Amanda.
Back to me. Back to me. Okay, I don't know if you can answer this, David, but would you say intentional underreporting of disabilities was as common then as now?
I would guess that is true, that both in terms of self-reporting and the system reporting was very much, it was not something that you would talk about generally. In many cases, it was either there was a kind of a societal quietness, and it wasn't until really, I think, in the movement leading up towards the ADA and that recognition of a wide range of disabilities, that there's kind of things to be able to gain from speaking up, that people in isolated situations were often felt shame from either having to be accommodated or having to be different. Certainly in the 50s, the idea of being different and standing out in many ways was not something that you wanted to call attention to.
Okay, one quick question and then is there one polio or a different type that afflicts children versus adults?
It's the same virus. It's just it affects mostly children, but there's a small minority of cases that do affect that hit adults.
I am really intrigued by the question about people, which Mira asked about did it make it sort of almost more mainstream, because my fiance's eldest sister has polio, that you don't think about it, and occasionally say, oh, well, she has one leg shorter than that. It is lots of people had polio, and if they were lucky enough to walk away from it in some way, you just went on. So, and remember our presidential candidate who had an arm that did not function.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
so it's interesting how some people soldier on and then other people are stigmatized. So this has really given us a lot of food for thought. Really fascinating talk, David. Thank you for coming up with the idea, and we're happy to have you here. And I know as you explore more, you will keep us posted. We have lots of programs coming up, and if you feel like you'd like to make a donation to the Spy Museum, we will always accept one. So thank you, everyone, but especially David.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you all.